We're now joined by Matthew Knittel. He's the director of the Independent Fiscal Office. Matt, thank you for joining me.
Hi, Phil. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, your office released a report last week that was offering some estimates of revenue for the state. What inspired that report?
Well, we did receive a request from the General Assembly in order to take a reevaluation of the general fund revenues that could be expected. My office does have a regular release that we put out on May 20th each year, but a member of the General Assembly was interested in a real-time update to the general fund revenue situation.
Now, what was the state of Pennsylvania's revenues before the coronavirus hit?
Before the virus hit, it was actually doing quite well. We think we were up about roughly 165 million above our projection, and for the budget office, they had a similar overage in terms of their revenue. So things were holding up quite well before the virus hit.
So how did you go about approaching this estimate? Certainly this is a circumstance that is very unusual. And how do you begin to make certain types of assumptions that you need to make?
Well, the most important assumption for the purpose of this update was how long do we assume the business closures go on? And for the purpose of this update, what we did is we used a best case scenario. We used two scenarios. One assumed a 6-week business closure, and the second one assumed a 10-week business closure. And the reason we did that was, again, because it was a best case scenario and because we were going to update our estimate on May 20th, which is roughly equivalent to a 10-week business closure. So that was the most important assumption that we had to make for the projection.
So let's take each of those in turn. Let's look at the 6-week projection. What did you find in that?
Well, overall, for the 6-week projection, what we found is that over the 2 years, both for this fiscal year and next, we thought there would be a shortfall relative to our original projection of about $2.7 billion. And most of that would be a shortfall in personal income taxes, corporate net income taxes, and sales and use taxes.
And so that was the best case, or the best case scenario. So the worst case was that 10-week. How is it different from the 6-week?
Yeah, for the 10-week scenario, and again, the difference between the two is just the length of the business closures. Under both scenarios, we thought about 1.1 million workers would be temporarily laid off and file for unemployment compensation. Under the 10-week closure, we thought the revenue shortfall would be closer to about $4 billion. Again, with the same revenue sources coming up short: personal income, sales and use, and corporate net income.
Now, there is the expectation that the federal government will be providing certain types of monies coming into the state. What different types of funds do you think will be coming in?
In the update, we had an estimate of the federal stimulus that was coming into the state, and we thought it would be roughly about $50 billion, most of it coming in calendar year 2020, and that does include between about $6 and $8 billion of additional state unemployment compensation. But the largest pieces of the federal stimulus, of course, would be the individual federal rebates. So these are going to taxpayers and to certain other elderly. We thought that would be about $10.5 billion. And then, of course, the next largest piece for individuals is the larger federal unemployment compensation, the bonus payments, if you will. We had that up close to $8 or $9 billion. And then the final piece that's also quite large is the small business loans that are forgivable if they're used for certain purposes. And we had that at about $12 or $13 billion.
So when we look at the money going to individuals, given that businesses are closed and people are under a stay-at-home order, once people receive that money, where does it go? Or where are you thinking that it will go?
So that's a very important question in terms of the individual rebates. There's a lot of uncertainty. So we think for the rebates, a lot of folks will be using it for necessities. They may be using it for mortgage payments or student loans or car payments or utilities. We don't think a lot of it will flow into more discretionary spending. And certainly for the unemployment compensation payments, we do think those will backfill non-discretionary spending. So such, again, rent and mortgage and utilities, bills that have to be paid.
Now, for businesses, do you see the same thing, or do you expect them to use the money in different ways?
We do expect the same thing. And in fact, under the federal guidelines, the forgivable small business loans, they must be used for rent or utilities or mortgage or to retain employees who would have otherwise been laid off. So we view the federal stimulus not being stimulus in this case, but really kind of minimizing the damage. So it's very different from stimulus that was provided in prior years, where businesses might receive some money and they might try to expand or buy new equipment. In this case, they're using the funds to stay solvent, to avoid bankruptcy.
Now let's look at some of the different taxes that the state raises revenue through. Now certainly the business shutdown and layoffs will affect taxes in many different ways. But let's look at personal income tax. What are you seeing that in terms of the specific impact?
Yeah, in terms of personal income tax, so we do have the most of the shortfall occurring with the personal income tax, and I'm just looking at our number for the current year. We have a shortfall roughly of about $1.7 billion, but much of that shortfall is due to shifting. So these monies are getting shifted out of this year into next fiscal year. About 1.5 billion of that is in fact shifted. Most of that shift is the final payments that we ordinarily receive in April. They're getting shifted out to next fiscal year. So we don't think we lose those monies. We just think there's a delay, and we think that it's going to create some challenges in terms of cash flow for the state.
Now let's look at the sales taxes. With businesses shut down, that pretty much closes off a lot of the sales taxes. What are you seeing there?
Yeah, for sales tax, what we're seeing is, depending on the scenario, there could be a loss this year of between $400 and $700 million. And as you noted, much of this is from dining out, from restaurants and discretionary type spending. So a lot of the sales tax base does come from dining out, roughly 10 to 15% of all sales taxes we receive. And of course, currently, restaurants can only do takeout. So we're losing a large amount of our monies there. The other portion is car dealerships. So some car dealerships were open. My understanding is now they are not supposed to be operating, but there's an effort underway so they could begin operations. But we do receive a significant portion of our sales tax from motor vehicle sales.
Now, how will this affect corporate profits over this time period?
Yeah, that's a very important question. So we had in our two scenarios, we assumed that corporate profits would fall by about 15% in scenario one, which is the best case scenario. In scenario two, we assumed that they would drop by 25%. I would view that as optimistic. I've seen national forecasts that had corporate profits dropping by about 33% or even 40%. So we do expect corporate profits to take a significant hit, and therefore our corporate net income tax revenues as well.
Now, when you put out a report like this, how is it used by the legislature?
I think it's used by the legislature more to inform the debate. That is, to put a number out there from which a discussion could start. So you read a lot of things in the general media. Other states are putting out estimates. So it's hard to get an idea of a ballpark. What does this mean by what we're looking at? And that's why it was necessary to define these scenarios. Exactly what are you assuming, and how does that translate into the revenues? And so a member of the General Assembly could look at our report and said, well, I think the IFO is being too optimistic. I really think businesses will be closed by 2 months. And if they thought so, they could increase our estimate. But this was just a starting point. Again, kind of a best case scenario in order to get the discussion started.
So what do these figures tell you about how this will impact public services that Pennsylvania residents can expect to receive?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a big challenge in the upcoming budget. How do these shortfalls translate into the overall budget? And even right now, there's still a lot of uncertainty about how the federal stimulus funds, there were some direct grants to the states, how they can be used and for what purposes. So I think some of it will depend on that, about how it ultimately translates over to the state budget. And for the state budget, of course, much of the spending, just like a household, much of it is non-discretionary. It has to be made. There are contracts. There are healthcare programs that we're under obligation to fund them. And of course, all those programs will be under increasing pressure, in addition to other funds. So we haven't even talked about the lottery fund or the motor license fund, which are also going to come under a lot of stress.
One last question. You've been doing this for a long time, and you've seen recessions, you've seen other hits to our economy. Have you ever seen anything quite like this?
In my experience, I have not, where there's, I would refer to it kind of as a self-induced hibernation that just happens immediately. And the difficulty here is for the businesses, what they're used to is a slowdown in activity that's more gradual. But for these businesses to lose 100% of their cash flow immediately, it's very difficult. And yeah, as you know, there's really no precedent for it in historical record.
Well, Matthew Knittel from the Independent Fiscal Office, thank you for speaking with me.
Thanks very much, Phil. It's my pleasure.
PCN hits the road to bring you unparalleled access to election 2020 as you get ready to vote. We're traveling across the state to bring you complete, nonpartisan coverage of candidates and races that will impact Pennsylvania and you. Download the PCN Select app to watch live streams or on-demand programs. Get more at PCNTV.com. PCN, your access to Pennsylvania politics and policy.
We're now joined by Stephen Caruso. He is a reporter with the Pennsylvania Capital Star. Stephen, thank you for joining me.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Phil.
Now, on Monday, Governor Wolf joined a group of other governors from northeastern states to establish a council. What would that council do?
So that was kind of vague, but it's the idea of it seems to be that all these states will talk and they will come up with a plan for when the states decide to reopen. Because the coronavirus threat is passed enough that then they will coordinate that. So, the idea being that, these are like, we're talking Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut. These are all states on the I-95 corridor, the Acela corridor. They have like a regional economy they have to worry about more than even their individual state. Think of all the people who probably commute from New Jersey into New York City or from Delaware into Philly each day. And so the idea was just like, let's talk about how we're going to open up when we're finally feel like the coronavirus is, it isn't as much of a present threat. And let's then make sure we're coordinating like transit schedules, making sure that bars and restaurants are like, if a bar in Philly might be closed, but you can't just hop on to that, transit and go into New Jersey because they've opened a bar. I think the idea is just like, if they don't want to, not talk to each other and then do something wrong and cause a whole nother outbreak to come back.
How have Republicans in the Pennsylvania state government responded to this?
So I think what we've seen is that they're kind of frustrated because what Republicans have been asking for the last couple of weeks is just Wolf involve us, please. Like they've advanced some bills to like set up task force of interchamber cooperation between the General Assembly and Wolf to like manage coming out of the coronavirus response. They've been kind of criticizing at first somewhat quietly, now more and more loudly Wolf's response of shutting down businesses. And then, so I think then Wolf coming out and saying that I'm going to now coordinate my recovery efforts from coronavirus with these 6 other governors, 5 of whom were Democrats. A Republican, Charlie Baker from Massachusetts, jumped in Monday evening. I think it struck a lot of them the wrong way. We saw statements from Senate and House Republicans, both basically making the point of like, we are the duly elected representatives of the state and not these out of state. I believe one statement at least uses from like leftist governors. So we had deserved to have just as much of a voice as these governors. So I think for a lot of Republicans it was like, we're right here. Why don't you talk to us first?
Now, there's also a similar movement on the West Coast between some of the West Coast states to coordinate together. Has there been any response, or have you seen any response from the White House or from the federal level on this type of coordination?
Yeah, so we saw some tweets from Trump, and then he kind of elaborated somewhat in his press conference on Monday, where he took a really hard stance against it. Trump, his point was basically, I have the supreme authority to decide what will stay open, what will close. Jury is still out on legal experts on that. I believe that's gotten some pushback from Democrats. I think even some libertarianish voices. Justin Amash, for example, the Michigan congressperson who became an independent, was like, from what I saw, was not too happy about that assertion of executive authority. I think it does put us in this like tricky question of federalism. I don't have the answer to that, but it's something that I've was hoping to answer. Sadly, it's hard to get a hold of people in the middle of a pandemic.
Now, as there, some of these early steps to address what comes after or how we come out of the stay-at-home orders and the lockdowns, has Governor Wolf offered any kind of timeline for how he thinks this is going to play out?
No timeline yet. We don't have a date. We don't have any sort of, like we have 6 weeks or whatever. There's none of that yet. Most of Wolf's orders are indefinite, or at least lasting to the end of April. He can extend those, though. Also, a legal challenge to his orders was thrown out on Monday by the state Supreme Court. So I don't know of any other way that it could go away outside of legislative action. Wolf has offered, especially Monday, he kind of was very hesitant on details until Monday when he came out, A, with this coalition, and B, in a speech on Monday night, Wolf kind of also like backing up with something that the Secretary of Health, Rachel Levine, said earlier that day. He laid out these conditions of I will start to consider opening things back up. And even that, it wasn't clear what that means. That might just mean that, restaurants can let 10 people in. All this stuff is uncertain, but he basically said until we have better testing, more PPE, more medical equipment, and and potentially even, we're talking about a vaccine in the works, ways that this virus can be contained, and in a way that also it won't overwhelm health systems. Because I think that's been the overriding concern, if you go by Wolf's public remarks, is that his goal with everything is making sure that the virus does not spread so quickly that we run out of hospital space, run out of ventilators, and people start needlessly dying from just a lack of treatment.
Now, you cover the House for the Pennsylvania Capital Star, and one of the bills that has been moving through it has been dealing with a task force that was intended to address some of the post-pandemic recovery efforts. What would that bill do?
So basically, it's as I mentioned, the Republicans in the General Assembly have been saying we want a voice in this process. So it would set up a 25-member commission. It'd be weighted towards lawmakers. I think they'd be 15 or 16 of the people in this task force, but also include some appointees from Governor Wolf and the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, Republican Thomas Saylor, and they would basically all kind of gather and have the ability to investigate, request information, make recommendations for action. They have no hard ability to implement policy themselves. I assume they'd be able to, recommend actions and maybe, come up with legislation that may eventually be introduced in the General Assembly. So, a relatively, it doesn't seemingly have a lot of authority, but Democrats were painting as a attempt to add bureaucracy that could, muddle Wolf's response. And, that bill passed the House last week. No word if the Senate's going to take it up. But, we also have these proposals percolating in the General Assembly to just get rid of Wolf's business closure standards or modify them. And that we've seen that now the House and Senate, after we kind of weren't sure, but they clarified yesterday after Wolf made this interstate council announcement that oh no, we're going to pass legislation to change Wolf's business closure standards. So, all of this is kind of up in the air this week. So today, the House is in session and we'll be trying to, today, Tuesday, and I'll be trying to keep track of that from the comfort of this laptop in this lovely home here.
Now, you mentioned the House's response to this non-life sustaining business closure. What was their response? If we go back to when it was initially implemented, how did they respond to it then?
I think there was hope for a better rollout. The rollout of the list. There were questions immediately on the list. For example, Wolf announces it March 19th at 5:00 on a Thursday night. This comes in, and the list immediately that itself was the way it was hosted. It was hard for people to get a copy of it. The people were taking to social media to complain about that. And then when you look at the list, there were some things that were unclear. That the classifications were sort of not vague, but just, I don't know, hard to understand. And then you look through it, and so things like laundromats are deemed non-essential. And there are a lot of people who don't own a washer or dryer in their home. And for those people, how are they going to wash their clothes? That was fixed, but like that, as emblematic. I mean, and that was a concern brought by Democrats as well as Republicans with that list. So these like that to me is kind of emblematic of this rollout that happened. And Wolf has made changes post facto, but it's not like it's been kind of like they've kind of trickled out. I haven't seen too many announcements about that. For example, gun shops were also allowed to open on a case-by-case basis if they limited customers. So I think the criticism is that it was a chaotic rollout. And I've heard that from Democrats and Republicans in the General Assembly. But Republicans have just been more assertive that, okay, because of this, we're going to step in and set the standards. Like you've done what you can do as an executive, but we're going to come in as the co-equal branch and say these are the new standards.
Now, the coronavirus has had an impact throughout the state on many different levels, and you recently wrote a story about how it is impacting exchange students. What did you find?
So what we saw is that I mean, it depends on the organization, but there were students, and there was one student outside of Carlisle who was from Italy, and was forced to go home forced is, I guess, a strong word, but this exchange agency said that if you don't go back to Italy, which is obviously ground zero for the epidemic, we will revoke your visa, revoke your and revoke your health care, which this organization provided. So I think it left a lot of parents in the lurch of like, so I'm forced to choose either between you taking away the things that let this kid stay legally in this country where I might be able to keep them safe, or they have to run a gauntlet through airports and airplanes and all this transportation to get to their home and potentially catch the virus, and then going back to a place where it's even worse. I think for a lot of parents, it's a stressful situation, especially if you're an exchange student. You're taking on the responsibility of like watching this kid like they're your own for 8 months or so. It can be up to a year, and that left a lot of parents feeling hopeless. Which I think feeling hopeless is probably a common reaction to this massive pandemic right now.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you'll be covering the House session from your home. How has the need for remote working affected your ability to cover the House?
It's meant that I feel like I'm being even more annoying to the people I talk to because I have to text them a lot. I mean, honestly, in some ways, the House and the Senate were already well suited for this. There is already a live streaming of most of the committee hearings and of the House floor. There's nuances that are harder to get. For example, the way in the House they record it is you can only hear who is speaking on the floor. If you actually go and sit in the balcony, like I like to do for some of the testier floor debates that we're probably going to see today, you hear all of the banter. You hear jeers and laughs and claps and all sorts of details that are never really caught up on the stream. I think that there are definitely concerns. For example, like Governor Tom Wolf, as of today, has gone a whole month without having an in-person press conference. Governor Andrew Cuomo has been holding in-person events, so has President Trump. And you are reliant upon the governor's spokespeople to kind of go through questions and ask their question. And I have no evidence that they're avoiding tough questions, but it's just you don't know, and they try to get back to you with an answer for everything, but there's a big difference between what is answered by a spokesperson and what is said out of the elected official's mouth. I would say from the leadership in both chambers, there have been a handful of conference calls, but not too many. I think it's a rapidly adjusting dynamic. I wrote a story right around when this started that where there was advice from that the best thing we can do is maybe not give trust, but give good faith to the people leading us. And I think that's always kind of part of journalism. They'll trust but verify, and it's just like it kind of just becomes even more important. That's like you don't want to jump to conclusions, but you have to be watchful because sometimes systems fail and sometimes people don't answer messages, and you have to keep a balance of making sure you don't think it's all just the system working against you, trying to hide things from you.
Well, Stephen Caruso for the Pennsylvania Capital Star, thank you for speaking with me.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Phil. Stay safe.
PCN brings the distinct aspects of Pennsylvania and its residents to your favorite screen.
Hear from state government and community leaders during unedited, balanced coverage of politics and policy.
Dig into the rich history and culture of the state, presented by notable residents and historians.
Score a view of the best high school, college, and world-class athletes competing across the state, and much, much more.
Start exploring the Keystone State today on PCN and the PCN app.
We're now joined by Pennsylvania State Victim Advocate Jennifer Storm. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Governor Tom Wolf recently went forward with a plan to release some certain number of inmates from prisons, from state prisons, in response to the coronavirus. What was that plan? What did he end up doing?
Yeah. So what we're looking at right now is a limited number of inmates who have been identified as nonviolent, where there are no crime victims associated. We're also further vetting those cases to make sure that there's no history of violence, right? So if they're in on a drug charge, but maybe they have an active PFA or a history of violence. So we're working very closely together to vet all of those individuals to make sure that anyone that is getting released under this reprieve is truly a nonviolent offender and would pose no threat to the public.
Now, do you know what the timeline is on the release? How quickly are they looking to get people out of prisons?
It's definitely, a lot of people think it seems to be rather quick, and it's not. State release takes time. It's a process. It's not as simple as county release, where we have seen, some of our county jails have released some folks rather quickly. The state process is much more lengthy. There's a lot of paperwork involved. There's a lot of evaluation, and there's a lot of different checks and balances, which is important, right? So parole's looking at it. We're looking at it. The district attorneys are looking at the cases. And then the department is doing their due diligence also to make sure that everything is in line, and that when somebody is released, we know 100% to the best of our ability that they don't have a history of violence, and they certainly don't have an active crime victim.
So are these intended to be permanent releases, or will they be returning to prison at some point?
I think it depends. It depends how close they are to their min, and the department would better be able to answer that question. I know what they're going to do is start putting forth individuals to the governor, because the governor does have to formally issue a reprieve. We have a lot of cases that we call parole approval pending. And that essentially means, so at the state level, between OVA and the Board of Probation and Parole, we're working very far in advance. Like, we're reaching out to crime victims 9 months prior to an inmate hitting his min. So before an inmate is even eligible for review, we're already reaching out to those victims. So we're reviewing cases quite early. And then if they get a positive board action, that oftentimes happens before their actual minimum date is realized. So what they're looking at is roughly 400 cases where the minimum date hasn't been realized yet, but they've gone through all the processes and they have a parole approval. So those are the cases that they're looking at first, and those will slowly start going to the governor. I wouldn't expect a large amount of individuals coming out of our state prison each day. It's going to be a slow kind of tick as long as all these checks are in place.
Now, at what point did your office become involved? Because there was an effort to try to release some people through the court system.
Sure.
At what point are you notified, or you brought into the system?
Yeah. So I've been communicating with Secretary Wetzel from the moment this crisis hit. And quite frankly, a lot of us were discussing this prior to the state even kind of going under our emergency declaration, talking about processes and what would this look like and what changes would need to occur. So certainly we were having conversations. And then as things started to develop in New York with Rikers Island, there was a lot of fear. And then there was also a lot of calls from entities for release. So Secretary Wetzel and I communicate almost daily. And so we were talking about, what offenders could we identify? Where could we come up with agreement? And the administration was obviously very much aware of the daily communication that we had. The District Attorneys Association was involved from day one as well, to make sure that this was a collaborative involvement. And so there were conversations happening with the legislature, and then we actually all got on one big call and really kind of walked through the legislation. And that wasn't able to be realized, and certainly there are reasons for that the legislature had. I think the governor saw a pressing issue at foot and wanted to be able to do something. So then the reprieve order came out.
Now, you mentioned the legislation that was working its way through the system. What was in that bill?
It was very similar to what we're looking at. So they were looking at offenders that were nonviolent, that had that had no history of, 10 year, had to be 10-year free from criminal history, no misconducts while they were in the institution. I believe the legislature wanted to cap the number of inmates who could be released, and I think that number was about 450. They were looking at making sure that anyone that did leave a facility, once the declaration expired, that they were returned to that facility to serve the remainder of their time. So those were some of the pieces in the bill that the DA had to say, obviously, that the district attorneys were able to look at these cases and kind of give their input prior to any release decision. So very similar to what we're actually doing now.
Talk a little bit about what your office does and the type of unique input that your office offers this type of process.
So the Office of Victim Advocate is legally mandated to provide all the post-sentencing services to crime victims and survivors. And so that's really anything that happens in that case once they are sentenced to the state. So they could be being supervised at the state level, or they could be incarcerated at the state level. Victims still have a litany of legal rights. Most of those come by way of notification, but a lot of it comes by the way of input. And so certainly when parole consideration is being given, victims have a right to talk to the parole board and to raise safety concerns, to talk about the impact of the crime and what that impact had on them. And then certainly, which is oftentimes really important, talk about any of the conduct that inmate may have engaged in while they were incarcerated, right? Were they writing to the victim? Were they threatening the victim from prison? Were they in good standing? And did they do everything that they were supposed to do, right? So victims have that opportunity to bring forth input. It is but one factor in a litany of factors that the parole board looks at upon release. And then if and when that person is paroled, we make sure that the victim or surviving family member knows when they're being released so that they can plan accordingly. They can kind of readjust to the reality of that person coming back into the community. And we talk with them about safety planning. We talk with them about, what do you do if you see them in the community, the emotional toll that could take, and kind of, helping them integrate back into a reality of that person being back in their community.
Do you feel that the interest of crime victims have been properly taken into consideration during this process?
I do, 150%. Like I said, Secretary Wetzel and I have communicated almost daily on this. His commitment was to try to balance public safety with the public health crisis, pending in the institutions, and trying to keep not just the inmates, but staff safe. And so I think that this has been very thoughtful, very coordinated, probably one of the most coordinated processes that I have witnessed in my 7 years in state government in this position. Everyone has been incredibly thoughtful and sensitive and trying to make sure that we're not doing anything that could create trauma or further harm to people, but that we're, releasing some individuals that don't pose a threat to try to help Secretary Wetzel and the institutions balance the social distancing need.
How will your office monitor the progress of these releases and what happens afterwards?
So we actually technically get an email on every single case that's going through the process. And so we'll get that email, we'll do our diligence, we'll look everything up that we have access to. Some of the concerns that some of the victim services field has raised, and they're legitimate, is that we don't have access to active child abuse case history. That would obviously be held at the local level. And because of a lot of the confidentiality concerns, a lot of that information just cannot be accessed. And we don't have access to a repository for sexual violence protective orders. And so those are two kind of areas that we realize we have some gaps. And so we're relying on, hopefully, the district attorneys to catch that at the county level. They are also getting the same email that we are. They're seeing the same offenders and they're vetting those offenders at their level as well. So it's not completely 100%, perfect, as nothing is, especially in state government. But it is as thorough and as thoughtful as one process can be.
What resources are available for community members who want to know more about people being released that may be in their community?
Yeah. So typically you don't have public community notification when individuals are released. And oftentimes that's due to, there just isn't a right for that unless they are identified as a sexually violent predator. And then there's a whole Megan's Law legal requirement for community notification. The DOC has great information on their website. They do press releases. They have information. They have an inmate locator. So if someone is curious about a particular offender and wants to know what their status is, they can certainly look them up on the inmate locator. But to that extent, there wouldn't be any type of community notifications being put out. And that's for the safety of everyone involved.
Given the need to stay at home, the stay-at-home orders, how has your office been operating?
So most of us are working from home. I'm going into the office every week because we do have on-site staff that actually have to be there. We have mail, which is a big part of what we do. We have to print out notifications. We have to mail those notifications. So we've got about 5 staff out of what would normally be 32 on site at any time. Social distancing, we've got gloves, we've got masks, we've got cleansing materials. So we're really being careful. When we go into our building, our temperature gets checked and we get like a little approval sticker on our state badge before we can enter the building, and we have to sign in and sign out. So we're really being super careful. The Commonwealth has been great. They've given laptops to those of my staff who wouldn't otherwise be able to work from home. And so we are fully up and operational and running all of our tasks as we would if we were on site. So.
Well, Pennsylvania State Victim Advocate Jennifer Storm, thank you for speaking with me.
Yeah, thank you for having me virtually.